The following podcast is sponsored by Structure Tech.
Permits are required when you're moving drain, waste, and vent and water lines. However, the building code, the plumbing code, particularly here, does not support permits being required for simple fixture changeout. Those are the areas where I really like to concentrate and make sure that everybody's aware of what the code says, because there's enough rules in our life without really making up more.
Welcome, everybody. You are listening to Structure Talk, a Structure Tech presentation. My name is Bill Ulrich, alongside Ruben Saltzman and Tessa Murray, as always. And on today's episode, back again by popular demand, is Andy Schreder. He is our building code guru. And so we thought we were going to open up for questions today, do a live Q&A over Facebook, and kind of talk about things building code related. I'm very excited about this, and there was some really great pod going on before we actually went live on Facebook. But I have a lot of questions for Andy, but I'm not going to monopolize all of his time. So Ruben, Tessa, say hello so everybody can hear your wonderful voices.
Hey.
Hello. Glad to be here. We're podcasting from home now. We're doing the Zoom thing because the wearing a face mask in the studio while you're trying to podcast just isn't very fun.
Well, and having a guest, if we've got a guest with us too, it's like, Larry, the producer, the guest, Bill, me, Ruben, all in a tiny little room. It's probably not the best either.
Yeah, we're trying to be responsible, right?
We're trying.
Yeah.
To the degree possible, yes.
Yes.
This episode is it's a call-in episode or a type-in episode, however we want to say it. And we're here to stump the building official. We're here to stump you, Andy. How's that sound?
I really appreciate the invitation to come back. These conversations, as Tess and I say too, it's actually very interesting. It's what we spend the majority of our working days doing. And I really appreciate the opportunity to bring to you what I experienced during the course of the day. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. We threw this out there on our Facebook page asking if people had questions. And we had a handful of questions that came in yesterday. We had some come in today. I sent you some of these questions ahead of time, Andy, and you were kind enough to point out that you don't do electrical inspections. So that part, I'm not going to try to stump you, but we will work some of those electrical questions in because, well, we can answer them.
For people that don't know, Andy, can you define what you actually do?
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
What you're inspecting, what you don't inspect?
Certainly. I'm a contract building official, and I work with municipalities on a variety of different levels. So instead of a jurisdiction employing their own building official, they have the option of contracting it out. There's a handful of companies in the state that do this. There's a number of one-man shows where one person will contract with 2 or 3 smaller townships, and then that's their business. That's what they do. There's a few of us, though, that employ multiple inspectors, and we have multiple contracts, and I'm one of them. I had previously worked for jurisdictions as an employee, as a building official, about 15, 16, 17 years, something like that. But it got increasingly difficult to respond to the needs of the contract. And I decided to take my toys and go play in my own sandbox. So we formed Rum River Construction Consultants. The company's actually been established since 2009 when we started doing continuing education for contractors and code officials. Because a friend of mine told me a long time ago, the best way to get good at a subject is to have to teach it to somebody else. And so I took that advice and started teaching contractors and code officials back in 2009. And then, so the business was established then. And then about 4 or 5 years ago, I decided to stop my employment directly with municipalities and go on my own. And in that time, now we've got, I think, 13 contracts. And we have 10 employees, and things are going quite well. Right now, I'm in the parking lot in Circle Pines. Just got done with some site inspections here. In a little while, I'm going to go back up to Oak Grove and continue on some work up there. So the variety is fantastic. I've got a lot more freedom over the results of my work, and I don't have to work under that governmental structure, which at times can be challenging, to say the least.
The heavy hand of the government.
I've developed quite an opinion over the years.
Yeah, and just so everybody who's hearing Andy speak, these suburbs or these municipalities he's talking about, they're basically on the north, northeast, northwest side of the Twin Cities metro area. So let's give him a softball pitch here. Can we put something in front of Andy and see how close we can come to stumping him?
Okay. All right. That sounds good. Well, if you are remodeling a kitchen, this one comes from David. I won't use last names. I don't know if people want us to use last names or not. This one comes from David, and he says, when a kitchen remodel only changes cabinets, floors, and appliances, do they also have to bring all of the electrical up to current code? Now, I'm throwing an electrical right at you, but I feel like you probably already know the answer anyway.
From an educational standpoint and also a liability standpoint, I'm very careful about answering questions outside of my discipline. We are what's called a combination inspector. I do plumbing, mechanical, building, energy code, of course. And recently we were approved from the state fire marshal's office for fire sprinkler system. So that's enough. That's a lot going on as it is. And I'm actually very careful, Ruben and guys, about offering any insight to electrical code, because I took some classes at North Hennepin, boy, a long time ago. But I really would rather not go down that road.
That's fine. I have no such qualms. I'm way less qualified than you, and I give advice out like candy.
So what is the answer?
The answer is no. You don't need to do squat. If you don't want to remodel any of your electrical stuff, you don't have to touch it. This is a common question that comes up during home inspections where people say, hey, they just remodeled the kitchen and they did this and they did that and blah, blah, blah. But why are there no GFCIs? Don't they have to do that? They need to bring it all up to code. And the answer is no. You can do all this stuff that doesn't require a permit. All right, Andy, let me give you the softball. I'm going to lob you this one. Do you need a permit to replace kitchen cabinets?
And that actually is no and yes. I would say you do not need a permit for that. And this is actually very good timing, because I just left a job here in one of our jurisdictions, and they are doing exactly that. Kitchen cabinets, flooring, and countertops. And they said, do I need a permit? And I said, the building code does not require a permit. However, I highly encourage you to apply for one. That gives us the ability to respond, no permit required for stated scope of work. That gives the homeowner and the contractor the record that they asked the question and that it was answered. Because as you guys know, when a property is sold, a lot of times that question will come up. Well, did you get a permit for that renovation? Did you get a permit for that basement finish? A lot of times the answer is yes, the code does require a permit for certain types of work. But in this occasion, I told him, the resident here, I said, I highly encourage you to apply for the permit. Again, that gives us the opportunity to write on there, signed, no permit fee, no permit required. There's no charge for that. We don't certainly charge for that. But that paper trail can be very beneficial in the future. So The answer is no, but please apply, because it doesn't take us but 5 or 10 minutes to process that. Then the jurisdiction has record, as does the code official, that question was asked. But then also, we can further identify if the kitchen sink is getting moved to the island, or they decided to make the window bigger over the sink. Okay, now that does require a permit. So then it also protects, because a contractor or homeowner would say, hey, wait a minute, on the 10th of September, Andy was out and said I didn't need a permit. Yes, I said you didn't need a permit for this scope of work. Something different is likely going to get a different answer.
Okay. So that brings us to moving the kitchen sink. Do you want to talk about any plumbing code changes, or should we shy away from those as well?
Well, there's really not any changes to the extent from, and at least what I was envisioning from this last project was moving a sink about 2 or 3 feet. Permits are required when you're moving drain, waste, and vent and water lines. That's essentially the change there. And this is where I really like to encourage people to be aware of the code. I've worked in jurisdictions before where an inspector would call out a permit for changing out a fixture, changing out a toilet, changing out a sink. In the way I read the code, that answer is no. When you relocate or reconfigure drain, waste, and vent and water lines, then yes, a permit is required. However, the building code, the plumbing code particularly here, does not support permits being required for simple fixture change-out. Those are the areas where I really like to concentrate and make sure that everybody's aware of what the code says, because there's enough rules in our life without really making up more. Thinking of it that way.
I have a follow-up question. If you move that sink from an outside wall to an island, obviously you're moving drain, waste, and vent and water lines.
Yes, sir.
It would be very hard to do that without doing it. Obviously, you need a permit for that.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And when you abandon that old waste, the old vent line that is in the exterior wall, do you have to open that wall up, or do you just leave it there and terminate it inside the wall?
That doesn't get imagine this, that doesn't get a consistent answer. I would say properly abandoning it with a glue, fitting with a glue cap, prime and glue would be sufficient. Certainly not a gym cap or a rubber cap or anything like that. Generally, if it's in front of you, you can address it. There's not a whole lot of support to opening up a wall to remove something if it's not being utilized any longer.
Very good. And I will say, you're an advocate for asking for permission not forgiveness. That's counterintuitive to most men walking the face of the earth.
Yes.
Just throwing that out there.
Yeah. It doesn't take very long for some of these things, and we've been in this business long enough that we can answer the questions before they're asked. That's, in my opinion, what makes a good inspector, a good police officer, a good carpenter, that they can anticipate where something's going to go sideways, and they know how to avoid that.
Cool.
Yeah, it always seems like when we get into trouble, any point in our lives, it's always a communication.
Claim ignorance.
And I'm just going to throw this out there for anybody who's just tuning in to this Facebook live stream. We're here with Andy Schreder to answer building code questions. If you got questions, feel free to type them in the chat.
All right, let's get him another one. Ruben?
All right. Well, about moving the kitchen sink, let's say you're going to move the kitchen sink and you want to reconnect your dishwasher, but we've got this new requirement that came out about 5 years ago for, you know where I'm going with this, right, Andy?
I do.
Let me set it up for anybody who doesn't know where we're going. There's this new requirement in Minnesota where for the dishwasher drain line, we used to have it where the dishwasher drain hose had to loop up to the underside of the kitchen counter. It had to touch the underside of the counter basically, and then it'd come back down. And the whole idea was to prevent water from going backwards back into the dishwasher. But then we changed our code about 5 years ago and we said, nah, you can no longer do that. Now you actually need to break the surface of the kitchen counter. You need to have a physical air gap. So the water is going to be pumped up above the spill line of the sink, and then it needs to fall back down into the receptor. Called an air gap. It's a device that mounts on your kitchen countertop. And nobody likes them, but they're required by code. All right. Commentary, please, Andy. What's up with these?
Okay, I have never seen a code provision be ignored so quickly and so consistently in the years I've been doing this. Generally, the contractors were of the opinion that we got by with this, without this for so many years. Therefore, they didn't really see the need for it. They didn't see the benefit of it or the need for it. So the contractors put up a lot of resistance at the very, very beginning of this. And inspectors as well. Again, a lot of times change isn't received very well if there's not a demonstrated purpose of it. In this case, there was really not a whole lot of evidence that I had seen for back siphonage or anything like that, sewer smells or, anything like that from the dishwasher. So it was really hard to embrace that change. And I heard and saw inspectors outright ignore it and even advocate against it, which is really unfortunate because there is a process in place for changing the code provisions. And it just takes time, like anything. But now I'm sure you're aware that that is not going to be in the upcoming code, plumbing code, when that's adopted. So that's going to be gone away, and we don't have to conveniently ignore it anymore. But now again, visited with a number of plumbers and looked at some specifications. A lot of the dishwashers have an integral air gap into the system itself, into the appliance itself. And some would say that would negate the need to have the air gap at the counter. Some other code officials that are very staunch code enforcers would say that the code didn't necessarily allow that. But again, that was one of those things that a lot of the code officials, me included, looked at our list of things to prioritize, life safety, manometer tests on furnace, gas line protections, fall protection. So these things that, kind of ranked a little higher on our list of things to be worried about. The air gap on the dishwasher stayed pretty low on that list. Yes.
Okay, that's wonderful. I'm pumping my fist in the air. Yes, because agents have been asking about this during our CE classes for many years now. And so Tessa and I always explain it. And I always tell people, it's one of those things that it's required. It is in the code, but building officials don't believe it is required. Contractors hate them. Plumbers don't like them. Homeowners hate them. They don't want this thing on the counter. What are we doing? And I said, you wait for the next code cycle. And my prediction is that these are going to fall off. But you're the first person I've actually heard anything official from. I've just been thinking this and hoping and keeping my fingers crossed.
Well, I thought maybe you exerted some influence.
Yeah, that's it. Well, maybe enough negative talk changes things. Not that I have an opinion. All right. That answers Dawn's question. So, Dawn's question, she said the air gap to install or not, seems everyone has a different answer. And, officially they are required today. But Dawn, if you don't put it in there, I'm not going to tell anybody. How's that?
When is that coming into play, Andy? When is that new code going to be adopted?
I've been hearing a variety of different dates, but it's supposed to be yet in 2020.
Oh,
wow.
this
Wow.
year.
That's the
Okay.
last prediction I heard.
Okay. All right. Very
One,
good.
if anything good comes out of 2020, it's the fact we don't need air gaps anymore at dishwashers. Ruben's
Yes.
going to go celebrate tonight, aren't you, Ruben? You're going to crack a beer and just celebrate.
That's exactly what I'm going to do because this is life changing.
How many countertops, granite, have this wonderful hole in them that will be now filled with some sort of...
Well, yeah. Now you can put a soap dispenser there.
Absolutely.
And those work really well all the time,
Yeah,
too.
I hate them.
Why do you hate them, Tessa?
They're unnecessary. I don't know. I saw, Ruben, I saw what you did to yours. It was genius. But for the average person, they're not going to do that. And then whenever you go to get the soap out, it's empty. And it's just another thing sticking up out of your countertop.
Well, see, and I'll share what I did with mine. If you haven't read my pin on Pinterest or wherever it's shared, is all you do is you replace the little tube in your soap dispenser with like a 3-foot tube that goes down into a 1-gallon jug of soap that sits at the base of your kitchen sink cabinet, and then you never ever run out of soap. I mean, you change out that gallon about once a year and it's nothing at that point. So I love my soap dispenser.
We've got another question here from Bill. Thank you, Bill, for writing this one in. If you're in the city and you're building a garage, let's say, and it's within the setback is really close to the lot line, but there's this fire protection code business. You have to have a firewall or something when you're next to your neighbor's residence, as I understand it. Does that fire protection have to go up the wall, underneath the soffit, up the fascia, and then up the roof to the level that they want, or is it just the wall?
It includes anything within that setback. So typically a rated assembly is going to identify what the thickness of the gypsum is. And sometimes it's even proprietary. Does it have to be USG or Gold Bond, whatever that drywall is, that fire resistive element. But it's a protection on both sides, to answer your question, up and around and over, anything that's within that setback.
Is the setback the same for a lot of municipalities?
That's a really good question, and it's really important that we differentiate between zoning and building. Zoning provisions are different in every jurisdiction. They have the ability to regulate the size, height, and location of buildings within the lot. Side yard setbacks I've seen anywhere from 5 to 25 feet. But the building code is uniform across the state. And I know we try to beat that drum regularly so people realize that the building code isn't different in one jurisdiction versus another. But specifically, the building code is going to regulate for a fire resistive element if the building is closer to the property line, whereas a zoning is more about nuisance and convenience and things like that.
Excellent. Thank you. I'm going to answer another question here. And this one came from somebody who had asked this on Facebook yesterday, asking about GFCI requirements. So I won't put you on the spot for this one, Andy, but I've got a good friend of mine. He's a home inspector out in Seattle, and I saw he was tuning into this one. So I'm going to drop his name. This comes from my buddy, Charles Buell, and he put together a nice little diagram showing where you're supposed to have AFCI and GFCI and GFCI requirements in different parts of houses. And when we share this podcast, we will include this diagram. And basically, I guess the question is, at what time period are you asking about? Because this changes constantly. Every 3 years, it seems like we've got new requirements for GFCIs. But today, if you've got a receptacle in a kitchen, doesn't matter how close it is to the sink, if it's in the kitchen, you need GFCI protection. If it's in a laundry room, you need GFCI protection. If it's in a bathroom, you need GFCI protection. So if it's in any of these rooms, regardless of sinks, you need it. If you're within 6 feet of other sinks, like a bar sink, then you need GFCI protection. So I hope that answers the GFCI question.
What about exteriors and unfinished basements and garages?
Well, this question only asks sinks, but Tessa, great point. You need them in all those places. Go ahead and rattle off a few, Tess.
Well, we said it already, but exterior garage, unfinished basements, kitchens, bathrooms, laundry rooms, pretty much everywhere, right? Except for bedrooms, maybe living rooms.
Yeah, and then there's like a really specific list of all these other places that we usually don't talk a lot about during home inspections, but we need them in all these other places too, like in boat houses and in crawl spaces and all these other places that are a little bit more obscure. So we're not going to try to rattle them all off.
So you're supposed to plug your refrigerator with a bunch of food in it into a GFCI outlet. So somebody can walk by, trip it, and let your food spoil because it's an outlet in the kitchen?
That's what's required. That is the requirement. And I've heard people complain about this and say, yeah, but you're going to get this nuisance tripping. I mean, it's a motor. As soon as it kicks on, you're going to get some nuisance tripping and you're going to have all your food spoil. But on the other side of that argument, I've heard that that's kind of a tired old argument where if your refrigerator is leaking so much current through the motor that it's actually tripping your GFCI, you've got a problem with it. And modern GFCIs don't experience that nuisance tripping. So I'm just sharing what I've heard. I don't know. I don't even know how a motor works. So I'm not going to claim to have the final answer there. But okay, we're really digging into this electrical thing. We got a lot more questions.
Yeah, and Andy said he's not touching electricals.
Yeah. So we could be talking about this on a time when we don't even have Andy. Okay, Andy, this one. Pat writes in and says, can you put it needs a closet to be a bedroom myth to rest?
I'd love to, but unfortunately that myth is so tightly ingrained into our vocabulary, it's hard to shake. It's hard to shake. There are some provisions in the sort of Rules 70-80 as they pertain to septic that talk about architectural details. Well, to me, when you're looking at life safety elements, you're looking at room size, which is only 70 square feet. You're looking at emergency escape and rescue openings, a window that you can safely get out of, God forbid, in case of a fire at your main door. Ceiling height, heat, and ventilation, that's enough to make a space habitable. So there's nothing to say that you can't have an armoire in your room, or there's nothing to say that the kids don't throw their clothes on the floor. So, try as we might, the old adage about you have to have a closet in order for it to be a bedroom, I'm not sure how to make that go away other than stop talking about it.
Okay.
Where did that come from initially, Andy? Why do so many people think that that's a requirement?
I think there was some language in like the early 70s or the early 80s that actually called out some of these architectural details that would call a bedroom a sleeping room, one that contained a closet or a room for storage, clothing storage or something like that. And people just latched onto that and they held onto that all these years. But there's a lot of different occasions where that's misleading, especially when you start talking about septic provisions and things like that. So I like to stick to the book because, again, there's enough rules out there without us trying to, impose our own impression of things. As long as a building has the minimum standards for size, light, ventilation is near and dear to my heart, just because I don't know that we're really taking enough account into the fact that we're living in a bag these days. Without proper ventilation air, we're breathing our own exhaust air and we're depleting these, a great big old shack, maybe not so much. But when you start to get into, dare I say, the tiny homes and some of these auxiliary dwelling units and things that are so small, you don't have the volume. You don't have the volume of air that people need to breathe. So you start talking about indoor air quality, dilution of contaminants and things like that. It's really important. I think there's, again, other things that we should concentrate on, other than if there's a rod and a shelf in a room to hang up your shirt.
Yeah, and I can tell you that ventilation problem becomes a really big deal when you have a Boston Terrier in your house. Because they do not ventilate.
One that's named Beans.
Yes, correct.
Noted.
Boys will compete with that, I'm afraid.
Another question here. This one comes from our very own Malind. For new construction, why is it still such a battle to make the attic access accessible?
Change. People resist change. As much as it is, making that attic access gasketed, and trying to teach people what an attic bypass is. What are the ramifications of not sealing that attic bypass? We've had a number of occasions where apartment buildings, for example, will employ the attic access and it's over the water heater. How do you get to that? So the big thing there, in our opinion, is to get it at plan review. If you can have a quality plan review and identify it when it's on paper, you don't have to deal with it when it's out in the field.
All right. Now, let me ask you, if you're inspecting a new construction home in one of your districts, your jurisdictions, Andy, and they've got an attic access panel and they spray it shut like they do every single new construction house I've ever been to. I'm using a little hyperbole here.
It's a nerve ending we've touched on.
What are you going to do?
Okay, this is what I do. This is what we do collectively. I look at this, guys, is that, just to realize and appreciate the fact that change happens slowly. Meaningful change certainly happens slowly. And our job as code officials is really threefold. It's to educate, inspect, and document. There are lines in the sand, life safety provisions when it comes to gas line air tests, tempered glazing, and things like that, where we choose to draw the line to say, do not pass go, do not collect $200. This, however, is such a big change, and it's so hard for people to digest. This is the way we approach it, much like slip sheet on foundation. But particularly, you're asking about attic accesses. When we come out to do an inspection, and the attic access is, well, first of all, backing up to the plan review. On our plan review comment sheets, it states Minnesota State Energy Code 1322. I forget the exact verbiage of the exact section, but it says attic bypasses shall be sealed, XYZ. So we give the applicant that information at the beginning of the job. Then fast forward to the actual construction. When that is not sealed, and you're right, Ruben, a lot of times it's not. Our job is to educate, again, is to tell the contractor, as you were informed during the plan review process, this attic access is a bypass, and therefore it needs to be gasketed. Here's the section. When they say B as in B, S as in S, they don't agree with it, we document that. And we make sure they know we document that. So in the years down the road, if there's any, if or when there's any ramifications from that, there's high humidity in the attic, there's any building deterioration, discoloration, they can go back to the building record to say, wait a minute, back in September of 2020, here's the plan review comment sheet that was issued by the code official. Here's the inspection record that shows you were told about it. Mr. Contractor, explain yourself. That's the approach we take. And so far, as you know, this has been in the code for several years. We are starting to see the fruits of our labor. There are some contractors that are actually installing that. You know why? Because we've taken a measured approach. If we were to fail the inspection, if we were to fail the actual permit and not let them get the certificate of occupancy because they didn't have a gasketed attic access, this would be a very short-lived career. It wouldn't last very long before they would contact one of the elected officials and we would be thrown out on our ear. So some of this is self-preservation. I'm not going to lie to you there. But the other thing is realizing that change happens slowly. The other thing that we can do is with the contractors, homeowners, but mainly the contractors, of course, is to put them in touch with the components that are out there. I'm not selling Scuttle Tight. I don't have them in my trunk, but that's a component that's built in Minnesota that does have the necessary components to meet code. So I try not to step in it, but when we're out on site, we tell them, I'm not selling this. I'm not advocating for it, but here's a solution. You can site build it. You can gasket it, looking at your time and material. It's up to you to decide if you want to do that or you want to buy the component, and here's the name. So we try to be as helpful as we can by putting them in touch with the resource.
Well, thank you for your candor on that one. I appreciate you just sharing exactly the way it works. Thank you, Andy.
You're welcome. That's the way we decided to handle it collectively amongst our inspectors. And so far, patience is a virtue. Over the years, we have seen some builders start to buy into this and they actually accept it. It's also helpful, too, to point out the code section so they can see. And anybody that knows me knows if we're going to require something, we're going to be able to back it up with a code section.
It's excellent. Got another question here. This is another plumbing one. I don't know how you feel about this one, but this one comes from our buddy Charles. And he said, since you need to have access to a slip joint connection, and for anybody who doesn't know what a slip joint is, you typically have it below kitchen sinks and bathroom sinks and showers and tubs where you have the drain coming out, and you've got a slip joint where you can actually move the trap up and down on an arm. That's a slip joint connection. Those always need to be accessible. It says so right in the code. So if those always need to be accessible, then why do we have so many bathtubs without an access panel?
Well, there are some plumbers that take the approach to that they glue the joints. They don't have a slip joint. They actually glue those connections so they're more durable. That way, if you have to snake that connection, there's less opportunity for that thing to break loose. That's been my experience.
That's what I've heard too.
I don't know, most might be the wrong word, but a lot.
Okay.
You know, a significant number that in order to avoid the access panel, especially depending on the floor layout, it's really hard to do that. You know, to put a return air grill in the back of a closet, no big deal. You know, but to have that another penetration in the hallway, or to have it, goodness, in the ceiling below, aesthetically, that's pretty hard to swallow.
Yeah, it's from what I've heard in every single case where there hasn't been access, I've been told it was glued. Wink, wink. Of course they say that, and I don't get to prove it.
The other joke I've heard too is that if you don't have an access and you do have a slip joint, you'll always know where the access goes because it's going to be that yellow spot on the ceiling right below the leak. So then you'll know right where to put the access. After you fix the problem, you'll know right where to put it.
Yes, exactly.
So did you guys explain the difference between a slip joint and a glued joint just for the non-technical listeners of our podcast?
Well, a glue joint is glued.
Yeah. What's a slip joint?
It's where the trap can slide up and down on the what's that piece? The tail piece.
And what prevents it from
It's
leaking?
I almost need to show a video or a diagram or a picture. I don't know how to use my words. How about you, Andy?
Like you can adjust them. You can unscrew and adjust it, whereas a glue, it's solid. You're not going to move those pipes around.
Right, and there's a compression ring there on that plastic nut that actually expands enough to close that opening off.
Wonderful explanation.
Cool. I got plumber Mark here chimed in. He said, yeah, slip joint is a compression fitting. So well put. That's you guys said the same thing he said there. And I got another question here, and this one was more for us. The question was, do we report missing high drain loops on dishwashers? As home inspectors, do we report that? And I'll just throw out there, Matt or Matthew, yes, we put those in our inspection reports. We put a link to a blog post that I wrote about this, but as far as our actual discussion with people buying homes, I don't remember the last time I actually mentioned this to somebody. It's more of a, hey, FYI, you're supposed to do this. And if you're buying or selling a home in Minneapolis enforces this. Like, this is a required repair item. And that kind of, I think that has kind of steered the way we report on this for home inspections. But as far as I'm concerned, on an importance scale of 1 to 10, I feel like that's a 1. It's like, if you never decide to change this, is it going to be a big deal? Probably not. All right. Where does the time go? We're 45 minutes in. We try to make these podcasts 20 to 30 minutes.
You know what? Do we have time for one quick question for Andy? I was just going to ask, hey, Andy, with some of these new code changes that are coming, what are some of the biggest ones that are on the way?
Well, that's a good question, and one that we're working on right now, and it really pertains to decks. The braced wall provisions for narrow wall bracing and garage fronts and things like that. We've been working on that beast for quite some time. But the provisions as they pertain to deck construction went from a few pages to quite a few. One of our inspectors, Adam, actually is working on an in-house training program that's going to address this, because we really need to get on my soapbox just for a minute. There's a lot to be said for the loads that are imposed on a deck. Live loads, certainly the vertical loads of live load, dead load. For vertical, you can comprehend, you can understand the deck ledger board, that attachment. But what some people don't necessarily appreciate is the lateral loads. So if you can envision standing at the end of the deck, rocking left to right, that sway is one of the lateral loads imposed by a deck. The other is when you're standing at the house and you come to the end of the deck and you stop suddenly. That withdrawal or that pullout, that's what the tension ties are supposed to satisfy, is that connection detail. So the lateral loads is one. Also, footing sizes is something that's being addressed in the code. So my first and the most abrupt answer is going to be the changes in the residential code. And that's something that we're working on. Actually, a building block, one of our code training sessions is going to be centered on deck.
Interesting.
Nobody's ever built a deck properly. I'm just going to go out on a limb and say it. They're all made by uncles and beer. It's a disaster waiting to happen.
All of them.
A lot of weekend projects, that's for sure.
Okay, 98% of decks. All you builders building decks are awesome. You do a wonderful job. Andy, thank you again. It's always great to have you on, to have these conversations, because we know enough to be dangerous. you give us credibility. So thank you for doing that. And thank you everybody for tuning in and sending in your questions. We will catch you on the next episode. You've been listening to Structure Talk, a Structure Tech presentation. My name is Bill Ulrich, alongside Ruben Saltzman, Tessa Murray, and occasionally Andy Schreder. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, Andy.
Thank you.
For more information on how we can provide you with the right information about your home before you buy or sell, contact us at structuretech.com.